The movie starts with the complete world watching as an extraterrestrial mothership appears above Johannesburg. People believe it'll be the primary time they meet outsiders. When the military enters the mothership, the creatures show gaunt and ill vital signs. So the Johannesburg government devises a temporary arrangement for the prawns, an immense encampment called Locale 9, specifically underneath their mothership, to house 1.8 million prawns. Since the organization was unprepared, they erect obstructions and arm Locale 9. In any case, Area 9 gradually corrupts into a slum. Individuals hypothesize almost why the mothership cannot function, after finding film of the command module falling from the mothership. For a long time, the government invests cash to ensure the prawns, which comes about in a lower need for the individuals. Tembisa local people revolt and arrange to get the prawns out of town. They are disgusted, and encourage the prawns to take off their world alone. After a long time, the open puts weight on the government to move the prawns. As a result, the government locks in multinational join together, a weapons manufacturer, to handle the removal of the prawns into an unused colony, exterior of South Africa's cities. The executive declares the proposition to his workers at the MNU assembly. They will go to the ghettos, and have the residents sign an archive for a removal agreement. The bureaucrat's son-in-law is doled out as the field officer to coordinate the hands-on work within the slum. The bureaucrat's spouse shows the handicrafts her spouse made for her. Since he believes it is more noteworthy, the bureaucrat makes for blessings. The cameraman takes after the bureaucrat around whereas he works as a field officer. The videographer takes after him through the MNU weapons store. When they go to the ghettos, he records the bureaucrat presenting his right hand and assembly up with other people, counting his colleagues and his security guard. Tragically, the bureaucrat has a loathsome encounter with the colonel. He essentially wishes to sentence the PMC soldiers of fortune for bringing excessive and unnecessary capability to the battlefield. The colonel insults him and the cameraman. Afterward, the hired fighters, accompanied by the bureaucrat and his team, visit the ghettos. The right hand and security guard and cameraman make up the bureaucrat's crew. Tragically, the prawns as of now assaulted some hired soldiers when they arrive. They thump on many shacks and arrange to get the prawns' scribbles on the shapes. A few prawns are uncontrollable, whereas others sign eagerly and make a mess. So distant, they have cleared 1018 forms in Locale 9, Zone 4. They utilize cat chow to allure the prawns to sign the shapes. Specialists and knowledge believe the prawns stuck on soil are specialists and require of higher administration. Prawns seldom take initiative, since they watch. Inhabitants maintain a strategic distance from the prawns, but things are diverse inside the slum. The Nigerian group takes advantage of the prawns' aimlessness by scamming them, partner themselves with outsider weaponry, and indeed locks in an interspecies snaring. They are driven by impaired but solid pack pioneer. The bureaucrat and his colleagues split a joke around not interferometer with the gang, or they will be murdered. Whereas checking into houses, they come into a cottage with 50 prawn eggs. He says that the hanging dairy animals with link tubes interior the cottage gives sustenance to the prawn eggs, and orders the eggs to be burned. When they enter other shacks, they find concealed caches of outsider armament. The reality with respect to MNU's inclusion in the prawn exchange is, it is for the purpose of gathering outsider combat hardware for MNU to use. The seized extraterrestrial weapons are conveyed to the MNU for testing, and they realize that the arms stockpile as it were works when the prawns utilize it, since the technology and weapons as it were connected with prawn DNA. Meanwhile, 3 prawns, Christopher, his youthful child CJ, and Paul, look for outsider fuel and prawn innovation at the Locale 9 dumps. CJ gratefully finds one after 20 years, which delights Christopher. Whereas CJ departs for their domestic, the 2 outsiders return to Paul's cabin. There's a covered-up region interior the shed, with a delightfully created workstation. The workbench's objective is to change over the collected liquid into gasoline. The fuel is successfully changed over and made by the workbench, and it is exchanged into a silver cylinder. Tragically, the bureaucrat and his squad find their way to the shack. Whereas Paul bargains with them, Christopher hides. However, the encounter turns terrible, and the security officer limits Paul whereas the bureaucrat explores the shack. He finds the barrel and wriggles with it, until fuel splashes in his confront. He quickly orders the cameraman to cease filming, and returns before the camera, this time seizing the cylinder. They return exterior and offended Paul, but Paul heaves the security officer back to his hut, and pushes the bureaucrat into a barrel of fire. The colonel and his hired soldiers arrive and totally destroy Paul, and the bureaucrat burns his arm. He lets the surgeon settle his arm, whereas commenting on how rapidly Paul assaults. They keep collecting sprawls, until they arrive at Christopher's home. CJ is given sweet by the bureaucrat, but he tosses it at him. When they gotten to be rankled, they choose to check the hut. They reveal screens and other hardware within. The bureaucrat chokes and spews a parcel of fluids whereas checking. Shockingly, heaving is not the as it were side effect. He moreover endures from nail loss, migraines, and nosebleeds. He tries to restrain them, but it as it were makes things more regrettable. Christopher and CJ explore for the barrel, but it has vanished. At the Nigerian gang's base, they exchange cat food for the prawn's mechanized war equip. However, the pack murders one of the prawn dealers, so that the pack boss might expend its tissue. They accept that eating the prawn's tissue will give them with healing, and the capacity to utilize the prawn's weapons. After work, the bureaucrat returns to his domestic. His spouse welcomes him with a surprise for his advancement. He imagines to be well, but pardons himself to upchuck within the restroom. He hacks as they cut the cake, at that point vomits dark liquid onto the nourishment, and collapses. He goes to the clinic within the morning, whereas his spouse holds up within the holding up room. The specialist notices his harmed arm morphing into a prawn claw. The specialist rapidly summons the MNU military force, and the bureaucrat is put in a body bag. They transport him to MNU's lab, where they assess his body. A staff part discovers the barrel that he seized amid his residency within the lab. The bureaucrat endeavors to warn them, but no one pays consideration. 16 hours later, MNU brutally employments him as a test subject. They constrain him to utilize the outsider weaponry, and they find that his claw contains the same DNA as a prawn. The analysts, counting the director, concur to kill him after the experiment. They must take his organs and blood, while he is still within the transformation stage, and arrange to utilize his culminate adjust of outsider and human DNA in biotech. They can advantage from it. When the bureaucrat listens this, he assaults the analysts and escapes the lab. The director informs the bureaucrat's spouse, his girl, that he is changing into a prawn. At that point he gets a call from the lab, expressing he has fled. He directs the soldiers of fortune to seek after the official alive. Exterior, the bureaucrat scavenges food and clothing, covers up, and tries to call companions and family for help, but no one cares. When he goes to urge food, he listens a hostile news broadcast on TV. He is declared as a wanted outlaw and escapee, who contracted a transmissible ailment after mating with prawns. He covers up in Locale 9 for 31 hours after being uncovered, trusting no one will discover him. 40 hours after being uncovered, he looks for nourishment, and indeed tries to devour cat food. Be that as it may, he is incapable to process it, and he gets a call from his spouse, who asks him to take off her alone. He tries to defend himself against the lies, but she just cries and hangs up the phone. He cuts one of his claws, and endures the misery that ensues. Abruptly, mercenaries' helicopters chase him down. He escapes and comes to Christopher's cabin, and passes out due to blood misfortune from the mangled wound. He wakes up interior the lost command module dropship, which is covered up underneath Christopher's shack. When Christopher ponders where the barrel is, he clarifies that it was confiscated by the lab. CJ says that fuel is required to restart the mothership, and Christopher adds that a machine on board the mothership can even help the bureaucrat in invert transmutation. Getting the barrel, on the other hand, is a suicide endeavor. 56 hours after being exposed, the bureaucrat's alter has come to half his middle. His skin sheds for his body to retain the alter. His spouse out of the blue phones, giving promises, but he has no thought it may be a trap set up by the MNU and hired soldiers to discover his location. CJ concedes he misses their planet and needs to return, but Christopher explains they can't, since they do not have enough fuel, and appears them the modern colony guaranteed to them, but the bureaucrat enters and persuades them that they ought to not move, since it is littler than the cabin, comparative to concentration camps. The bureaucrat asks once more about what will happen in case the fuel is recuperated, and is reminded by Christopher that there are no guns. Frantic to return to regularity, he offers to purchase guns from the Nigerian gang. The following day, he voyages to the gang's base to purchase outsider weaponry, but they treat him forcefully in step. The group pioneer indeed orders that the bureaucrat's claw arm be disjoined. Whereas endeavoring to protect himself, the bureaucrat finds the extraterrestrial weapons. He immediately snatches an outsider sonic gun, and shoots at the group individuals, ordering the pack individuals to pack the weapons for him. The pack pioneer is fascinated by obtaining a prawn claw, and debilitates the bureaucrat, who is escaping with the alien weapon that he will claim him one day. When the hired fighters arrive at Christopher's shack, it is deserted. Christopher and the bureaucrat are at the MNU base, breaching to recover the cylinder, and effectively get it, but Christopher finds skin prawns, counting Paul, for brutal inquire about. Whereas the arrived soldiers of fortune start terminating within the lab, he gazes dumbfoundedly at his dead kind. The bureaucrat orders Christopher to keep in mind his son whereas terminating at the hired soldiers, who detonate when hit by the extraterrestrial weapons. Christopher returns to reality, and develops a bomb out of scraps within the lab, exploding it against the wall. They take an MNU car, and drive to the ghettos. The colonel and his mercenaries seek after them. When CJ arrives at Christopher's shack, he quickly hands him the cylinder that will control the dropship underneath. Christopher concedes that they will got to hold up 3 years sometime recently they can remedy the bureaucrat and save the prawns from the tests. The bureaucrat, enraged, thumps down Christopher and abandons the cabin, plummeting into the dropship. CJ embeds the barrel, and the whole dropship comes to life. Whereas the colonel arrives at the hovel and discovers Christopher interior, the bureaucrat endeavors to actuate the dropship. He undermines Christopher, talking approximately how much he appreciates seeing prawns kick the bucket, but the ground shakes, and they escape the cottage, observing the dropship influence within the air. The colonel orders the dropship to be terminated, and one of its motors is promptly crushed by a rocket. Christopher collapses to his knees as his dropship crashes, knowing that getting home is presently outlandish. The colonel and mercenaries detain Christopher, and seize the bureaucrat from the dropship, stacking him into their car. The Nigerian group suddenly ambushes the hired fighter escort, slamming with their vehicles. The gang battles them to require the bureaucrat prisoner, taking off Christopher, who is covering up on the dropship, to manipulate a button to reactivate the mothership. The group executes a ritual, and chops off the hostage's prawn hand. Meanwhile, CJ, remaining on the dropship, effectively actuates the mothership and all prawn technology, counting the prawn combat suit covered up within the gang's base. The suit checks the base, distinguishing the bureaucrat as a companion and the pack members as enemies, and murders each part of the gang. Whereas the hired fighter's exterior the base questioned Christopher around the revived mothership, he remains silent. A mercenary unit smokes out the bureaucrat, who is stowing away within the gang's fort. He has no choice but to put on the ensemble. He withdraws the base wearing his armored equip, and takes note the hired fighters who are taking Christopher hostage. He to begin with shows small concern and even trades Christopher for his release, until he listens the colonel arrange his hired fighters to kill Christopher. The bureaucrat returns to Christopher, executing the soldiers of fortune. The two sprint to the dropship, as more soldiers of fortune arrive to shoot them. The bureaucrat remains behind to spare Christopher time, who needs to welcome the bureaucrat along, but he knows somebody should keep the hired fighters at bay. He tells the bureaucrat that he will come in a long time to remedy and re-establish him to his ordinary self. The bureaucrat murders each soldier of fortune who shoots at his suit, and blood smears the ground. Christopher in the long run orders the mothership to extricate the dropship from the ground. A tractor bar develops from the mothership's core, lifting the dropship higher. The colonel notices and orders another rocket to be terminated, but the bureaucrat gets the rocket, that explodes, shattering the suit's cleared-out arm, but luckily protecting his hand. The colonel is infuriated as the dropship effectively rejoins the mothership, and bends his teeth by causing the battle suit the bureaucrat is wearing to malfunction. The bureaucrat slithers absent from the suit, 74 hours after being exposed. Just like the prawns, his cleared-out eye is swollen and yellow. The colonel corners the bureaucrat and focuses a weapon at his head. The prawn's slum all of a sudden encompasses the colonel, and mobs him, tearing his carcass separated to eat. The individuals celebrate, as the mothership leaves Earth. At that point the bureaucrat's collaborator reveals MNU's unlawful hereditary inquire about program. Taking after the resettlement, the government moves the 2.5 million non-natives to Area 10, and pulverizes Locale 9. The bureaucrat has totally turned into a prawn at the landfill, creating a metal bloom for his spouse. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more videos like this, please turn on the notifications and click the like button to support the channel. See you in the next video.